In the cold silence of the Bitterroot Mountains, a man haunted by his past and drowning in guilt finds himself at a crossroads. Kelvin Ward, a former U.S. Marine, lost everything in a tragic accident that took his wife's life. But in the depths of his despair, a small family of German shepherds fighting for survival in a forgotten cabin pulls him from the brink. This is a story of redemption, love, and second chances. Kelvin's journey of healing mirrors the unwavering loyalty of the dogs he vowed to protect. What happens when the storm rages? On watch now to discover how a broken man finds purpose through the love of 3 tiny puppies. Kelvin Ward had always been a man defined by duty. As a former U.S. Marine, he had spent years in the harshest corners of the world patching up soldiers and carrying the weight of countless lives in his hands. His experiences in combat, though painful, had shaped him into a man of strength and resilience. But the war was nothing compared to the battle he faced when he returned home. He had married Laura, the love of his life, before he shipped out. They had promised each other a future, one full of quiet nights and shared dreams. But the war had changed him. It had taken pieces of his soul, leaving him hollow in ways he couldn't explain. Laura noticed it, of course. The man she once knew was no longer there. Instead, she saw a stranger who would flinch at loud noises, who couldn't shake the memories of war no matter how hard he tried. Yet she loved him fiercely, never giving up hope that the man she married would return. But that hope shattered one winter night when Kelvin made the worst decision of his life. It was late, the kind of cold night that made even the air feel heavy. Laura had begged him not to drink, not to drive after the party. But in a moment of weakness, Kelvin didn't listen. He grabbed the bottle of whiskey, the one that had been his constant companion since returning from Afghanistan, and stepped into the truck. He could barely feel his hands on the wheel as he drove the road slick with ice and his thoughts clouded by guilt and regret. The whiskey burned as it went down, numbing the ache that had gnawed at him for so long. He didn't see the guardrail until it was too late. The crash was deafening. Glass, shattered metal crumpled, and in the chaos, Laura was thrown from her seat. Her body was lifeless by the time help arrived, the cold night air mixing with the warm blood that stained the snow. Kelvin survived, but as he stood at the wreckage, he knew he had lost everything. The guilt was unbearable. The love of his life was gone, taken in a moment of his recklessness. The uniform that had once made him proud now felt like a weight, a reminder of all that he had failed to protect. The man who had saved countless lives in combat was powerless to save the one that mattered most. For days, Kelvin didn't leave the house. He couldn't bring himself to face the world that had kept going while his had fallen apart. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, heard her laughter, and felt her absence like a wound that would never heal. The man who had once stood tall was now a shell of who he was. And so, with nothing left to hold on to, he made a decision. He would disappear. The world and everything that had tied him to it no longer mattered. Kelvin had made up his mind. There was nothing left for him in this world. The pain, the emptiness, it was all-consuming. The whiskey bottle sat beside him in the truck as he drove each mile, taking him further from the life he once knew, further from the man he once was. The road ahead was as cold and endless as the abyss that had swallowed his soul. The storm had been gathering for days. Snowflakes began to swirl around him, dancing in the headlights of his truck as he made his way up the mountain road to the cabin he had chosen. It was the kind of place no one would think to look for him. A small, forgotten cabin nestled deep in Bitterroot Mountains, Montana. No cell service, no maps, just silence and the deep snow. It was the perfect place to disappear. As the truck rumbled over the icy road, Kelvin gripped the wheel, his hands shaking but not from the cold. He couldn't feel much anymore. The warmth of his breath was the only thing that reminded him he was still alive, still human. He stared ahead, but his mind was far away, lost in the dark places where thoughts of Laura haunted him. The music of the storm outside seemed to drown out the voice in his head that kept telling him there was still a chance, still a reason to fight. He silenced it. He thought about the whiskey. He thought about the gun. Both were waiting for him just as they had been since the moment he stepped into the truck. The alcohol would numb the pain. The gun would bring the end. The silence he longed for. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, but he saw nothing but the swirling snow. It didn't matter. There was nothing left to go back to. The cabin finally appeared through the thick snowfall, an isolated silhouette in the distance. The roof sagged under the weight of the snow, the windows dark and untouched. It looked like a place forgotten by time, just like him, just like the life he no longer had a place in. Kelvin parked the truck, the engine sputtering to a stop. The storm had intensified, howling through the trees, but all he could feel was the crushing silence inside the cabin. The weight of the decision he had made was heavy on his chest as he stepped out of the truck, the biting cold sinking into his bones. The air was sharp and empty. The kind of quiet that could swallow a man whole. He dragged the duffel bag out of the truck bed, his body stiff from the cold and the weight of the world pressing down on him. The whiskey, the gun. Everything was there in his mind. It was time. The door to the cabin creaked open and he stepped inside. The stale air greeted him like an old forgotten friend. Dust floated in the dim light that filtered through the cracked walls. It smelled of old wood and long forgotten memories. Kelvin shut the door behind him, sealing himself in. He set the duffel bag down on the old worn bunk and sank onto it. His hand trembled as he pulled out the whiskey bottle, unscrewing the cap. The familiar burn filled his throat as the liquid slid down the warmth, momentarily chasing away the numbness. He could feel the weight of the gun under his jacket cold against his skin, but he didn't reach for it just yet. For the first time in days, the pain began to dull. The thoughts, the memories, all of it started to fade. But something deeper still lingered. Something he couldn't shake. It wasn't guilt, not anymore. It was emptiness. A void that swallowed him whole. He reached into the bag again, pulling out the gun. The cold steel felt like the only thing in the world that made sense, and yet it felt like nothing at all. As he held it in his hands, ready to end it all, a faint sound interrupted the silence. A soft, almost imperceptible cry from below. The sound was faint at first, almost like the wind, but it carried a subtle desperation. Kelvin froze, the gun still in his hand, the bottle of whiskey half emptied beside him. For a moment he thought he had imagined it, his mind playing tricks on him. But then it came again, quieter but unmistakable, a soft, feeble cry. His pulse quickened. What in the world could that be? His thoughts, clouded by the alcohol and the darkness that had overtaken him, couldn't make sense of it. The wind howled outside, pushing at the walls of the cabin, but this sound was different, closer. It wasn't the wind at all. He stood up, his legs stiff from both the cold and the weight of what he was about to do. He took a step toward the trapdoor in the corner of the cabin, the one that led down into the cellar. The sound had come from there, from beneath the floorboards. A shiver ran down his spine, but it wasn't the cold. Kelvin's hand, still holding the gun, was shaking again. This time not from the chill, but from the growing uncertainty gnawing at his resolve. He'd come here to end his life, to disappear. So why was he now drawn toward this strange noise, this tiny cry from below? His boots creaked against the wooden floor as he moved, the silence of the cabin amplifying every small sound. He reached the trapdoor and hesitated for a moment, listening. The cry had stopped, but there was a strange urgency in the air, as if something was waiting for him down there. Taking a deep breath, he crouched down and lifted the trapdoor, the old wood groaning in protest. The cold air from below rushed up, carrying with it a faint smell of damp earth and something else, something sharper. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the dim light below, but when they did, he saw it. A German shepherd mother, her body thin and covered in blood and frost, lay in the far corner of the cellar. Her breathing was ragged, her sides heaving with every labored breath. Beside her were three tiny, fragile puppies, no more than a few days old, their eyes still closed, their bodies trembling as they huddled close to their mother for warmth. The sight hit Kelvin like a punch to the chest. There in the dim light, surrounded by cold stone and the harshness of the world, lay a family that had fought to survive just like him. The mother dog lifted her head slowly, her amber eyes locking onto Kelvin's. She didn't snarl, she didn't bark. Instead, there was only a quiet plea in her gaze, as if asking him for something she couldn't say. She shifted just enough to cover her pups, her body trembling with exhaustion and pain. Kelvin's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't what he had expected. He had come here to end everything to escape. But now, standing in front of this small, vulnerable family, the weight of his decision felt heavier than ever. The emptiness that had consumed him seemed to waver, as if someone was calling him back from the edge. He lowered the gun slowly, his fingers still trembling as he reached out toward the dog. The cold stone floor bit at his knees as he knelt beside her. The tiny puppies whimpered weakly, their bodies too small and fragile to even lift their heads. Kelvin reached out to one, gently cradling it in his hands. It was so small, barely larger than a handful of fur. He could feel its tiny heart beating a soft rhythm of life. Kelvin's chest tightened as memories of his own lost family rushed back. His wife's smile, the warmth of their shared moments. And now in front of him was this mother protecting her children with the same fierce love he had once felt. For the first time in what felt like forever, something stirred within him, something that wasn't numb or empty. The dog's eyes never left him. They were filled with the kind of trust that only those who had nothing left to lose could give. And in that moment, Kelvin knew that everything had changed. This was no longer about him. He reached out carefully, brushing a bit of snow and frost from the mother dog's coat. She was weak but alive, still fighting, still holding on for her pups. Kelvin felt the weight of responsibility settle over him, replacing the emptiness. He wasn't alone anymore. Kelvin's hand hovered above the mother dog, his heart heavy as he gazed into her tired amber eyes. There was no hostility, no fear, only a quiet trust, a silent plea for help. The dog's eyes were full of vulnerability, but beneath them there was something else, something fierce, something unyielding. It wasn't just a dog asking for assistance, it was a mother fighting to protect her young. As Kelvin knelt beside her, he could feel the weight of that gaze pressing into him. She had no words, no way to express her gratitude or her need, but it was clear. She had already given everything she could to her pups, and now, in the last moments of her strength, she was relying on him. The storm raged outside, but within the cellar it was eerily quiet. The only sound was the faint whimpering of the puppies, their small bodies curled against their mother's side. Kelvin reached out slowly, brushing a layer of snow and frost from the dog's matted coat. She flinched slightly, her breath shallow, but she didn't pull away. Her body was emaciated, her ribs visible under her fur, yet her focus remained unbroken on her pups, on her family. It was as if nothing else mattered but them. Kelvin could feel her pain, the deep cuts on her legs, the gash along her flank where blood had dried and frozen. She had crawled through the snow to give birth in the cellar, choosing this place to hide away from predators, away from the world. But even in the direst circumstances, she had protected her pups with what little strength she had left. She had guarded them, keeping them warm, feeding them with whatever energy she could spare. Her love for them was palpable, a force stronger than the bitter cold that surrounded them. Kelvin's throat tightened as he watched her struggle to lift her head, her amber eyes never leaving his face. There was no fear in her expression, only an unwavering sense of purpose. Despite her exhaustion, despite her injuries, she didn't once growl or snap at him. There was only the quiet assurance of a mother's love. In that moment, Kelvin realized that he wasn't just looking at a dog. He was witnessing the essence of loyalty, of selflessness. This mother had given everything she had to protect her pups, even if it meant her own suffering. She had no voice to plead with him for help, no way to ask for mercy, but her eyes spoke volumes. She trusted him, and in return, he knew that he had to help. Kelvin swallowed hard, his resolve firming. He could feel the weight of her gaze, her trust, and he understood. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about her pups, and the responsibility he now had to ensure their survival. The storm outside howled louder, but inside the room felt warmer somehow. Kelvin's hand gently brushed over the mother dog's fur again, his fingers trembling. He could feel her heartbeat beneath his touch, weak but steady. She was alive, and she was fighting. He wasn't ready to let her die. Not yet. Not while there was still hope. Kelvin's hands were no longer shaking with doubt. As he gazed down at the mother dog and her tiny pups, he understood what he had to do. The gun, the whiskey, the thoughts of ending it all, those faded away as if they had never been. He had a new purpose now, one that didn't involve escape. It was about saving these lives. The storm outside continued to rage, but the cabin felt oddly still, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Kelvin stood up and moved toward the duffel bag. He had seen enough medical supplies in his life to know that most of what he carried with him wouldn't be enough to save the mother dog, but he had to try. The supplies in the bag, old bandages, expired morphine, and a few sterile vials were all he had, and they had to be enough. He knelt down beside the mother dog again, reaching out to gently touch her neck. She didn't flinch. Instead, her amber eyes softened as if acknowledging that he was there to help. Kelvin could see the gash on her rear leg more clearly now, a deep, frozen wound. The blood around it had long since coagulated, but the injury was still raw, still open. He would need to clean it, stitch it, and do everything he could to prevent infection. Kelvin took a deep breath and unzipped the duffel bag, his fingers moving with precision despite the lack of modern medical tools. He found a small bottle of saline solution, using it to clean the wound as best as he could. The dog flinched slightly, but she didn't growl or retreat. Her trust was unwavering, and that gave Kelvin the courage he needed. With shaky hands, he applied the bandages, wrapping the leg as carefully as he could, while the mother dog remained still, watching him with tired eyes. Kelvin shifted his focus to the puppies. They lay huddled together, their tiny bodies fragile and weak. They were so small, barely bigger than his hand, their fur damp with the chill of the cellar. He had no idea how long they had been there, struggling to survive in the cold, but their small cries and shaky movements told him they were still fighting. Kelvin reached down and gently scooped one of the puppies into his hands. Its tiny body trembled, its eyes still closed, but it instinctively nuzzled into his palm, seeking warmth and comfort. The bond between them was instant. He could feel the faintest flutter of its heartbeat, and something inside him stirred. This was life. This was what he had been missing. He gently placed the puppy beside its mother, who weakly nudged it with her nose, her body shaking with exhaustion, but still full of love. Kelvin knew the puppy needed nourishment, and quickly. He grabbed a small bottle from the medical kit, filled it with the last of the milk he had, and gently pressed the nipple to the puppy's mouth. The little one latched on instinctively, its small mouth moving as it suckled. As he watched the tiny pup feed, Kelvin felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He wasn't just keeping them alive, he was giving them a chance. He repeated the process with the other two puppies, each one sucking eagerly at the bottle, each one fighting for their survival. The mother dog lay beside them, her eyes slowly closing as she rested. Kelvin didn't know how long she had left, but for now she was content. For now she was no longer alone. Kelvin sat back on his heels, watching over the small family. The weight of the decision to save them settled on his shoulders, but it wasn't a burden. It was a responsibility he was willing to carry. As the hours passed, the storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cabin the atmosphere had shifted. Kelvin sat on the cold stone floor, his eyes fixed on the small family before him. The three puppies, their tiny bodies now a little stronger, had finished feeding and were curled up against their mother's side, nestled in the warmth of her body. She lay there, her breathing still shallow but steady. For the first time in days, Kelvin felt something other than emptiness. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere between cleaning wounds and feeding tiny mouths, he had found a reason to keep going. The thought was almost foreign to him. He hadn't had a real purpose in so long. But now, as he watched the mother dog and her pups, he realized something: they needed him. Kelvin's chest tightened, but not from pain. There was something else, a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. He was needed, he had a purpose, and it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about caring for these small lives, helping them to grow, to thrive. They depended on him, and in return they were pulling him back from the edge. He glanced down at the puppies, their small faces peaceful as they slept against their mother. He knew they were fragile, still far too weak to face the harsh world outside. But as long as he was there, they would have a chance. That realization hit him harder than anything. These small creatures, these innocent souls, had given him something he thought he had lost forever: hope. He reached out and gently stroked the mother dog's fur, his hand trembling with the weight of what had just unfolded. It wasn't just about saving their lives. It was about saving his own. He had been ready to end it all, to disappear into the cold night, but now he found himself here with a new responsibility. These dogs, these lives, had brought him back from the brink, and he wasn't going to let them down. The connection between him and the animals was undeniable. The mother dog's tired eyes met his, filled with quiet gratitude, and it was then that Kelvin understood. This wasn't just about survival. It was about love, loyalty, and sacrifice. The same things he had lost with Laura were now here in this small cabin, in the form of a German shepherd and her pups. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Kelvin felt his heart stir with something more than grief. Every small movement they made, the way the puppies nuzzled into their mother for warmth, the way the mother dog's body instinctively protected her pups, reminded him of the life he had once had, the life he had lost. But it also reminded him that life went on even in the most unlikely of places, and that love could still be found even in the coldest of storms. As he sat there, watching over them, a new sense of peace settled over him. He had no idea what the future held, but for now, this was enough. They needed him. And in a world that had once felt empty, that was all he needed. Kelvin sat in the quiet of the cabin, the soft sounds of the puppies and their mother filling the space with a sense of calm he hadn't felt in years. It was a fleeting peace, but it was peace nonetheless. The storm outside howled, but in the warmth of the cabin, Kelvin found himself slowly sinking into a new rhythm, a rhythm of care, of purpose. His life no longer felt like it was fading into the background. For the first time in a long while, he had something to hold on to. But that peace didn't last long. The first sign of trouble came in the form of an unfamiliar truck parked near the edge of the clearing. Kelvin noticed it just before dusk, its engine still running, the headlights cutting through the thick snow like a beacon. He wasn't sure why it caught his attention at first, but something about it felt wrong. His instincts, honed over years of service, told him this wasn't just a random vehicle passing through the storm. As he peered out the window, trying to catch a glimpse of the figures inside, a group of men began to emerge from the truck. They were dressed in heavy coats, their faces obscured by scarves and hoods, but their movements were deliberate. They weren't here for shelter. They were here for something else. Kelvin's stomach tightened. He didn't recognize any of them, but there was one thing he did know. They weren't here to offer help. The way they moved, the way they scanned the area told him they were searching for something or someone. His eyes narrowed as he recognized the leader of the group, a tall man with a rough beard and sharp eyes, Dale Morgan. The name hit Kelvin like a slap in the face. He'd heard of men like him before, those who operated in the shadows of the law, the kind who made their money trafficking animals, breeding them and selling them to the highest bidder. The German shepherds, prized for their intelligence and loyalty, were one of the most sought-after breeds in the illegal market. Kelvin's pulse quickened. The pieces fell into place. The men weren't here by chance. They were looking for the puppies. A wave of anxiety swept over him. The puppies were small, fragile, and still too weak to defend themselves. The mother, though fierce and protective, was in no condition to fight. The thought of what these men might do to them, the way they'd take them from this place from safety, filled him with a cold dread. The warmth he had just found seemed to fade, replaced by a tightening knot in his stomach. He couldn't let them take the puppies, not after everything he had already given. But Kelvin knew he couldn't take them on alone. Not with his past injuries, not with the limited resources he had. His hand instinctively went to the old rifle tucked in the corner of the room, but he hesitated. He didn't want to resort to violence, not unless he had no other choice. The men were getting closer, their footsteps crunching in the snow. Kelvin's heart pounded in his chest. He had to make a decision. He could feel the danger creeping closer like a storm gathering on the horizon. There was no time to waste. He needed to protect the puppies. He needed to protect the one thing that had brought him back from the brink. As the men drew near the cabin, Kelvin made his choice. He couldn't just wait and hope they'd leave. He had to act. He moved quickly, making sure the trapdoor was securely closed, hiding the puppies beneath it. He took a deep breath, grabbing the rifle and making his way to the door. The time for hiding was over. Kelvin stood still for a moment, listening to the crunching of boots outside, the storm still howling, but somehow quieter now, as if the world itself was holding its breath. His mind raced, scanning through every possibility. He couldn't afford to make a mistake, not with the puppies under the trap door, not with the stakes as high as they were. His hand tightened around the rifle as he made his way to the cabin's front window. He peered out cautiously, trying to see through the swirling snow. It wasn't just the truck parked earlier that had drawn his attention. It was the tracks in the snow, the footprints around the cabin, deep and fresh. They weren't his. These were new, made only moments ago, and they circled his cabin. The men were close, too close. A chill ran down Kelvin's spine as he realized they weren't here just to pass through. They were hunting. His heart began to race. They had been watching him, watching the cabin. He had been so focused on the truck earlier that he hadn't noticed how they had positioned themselves, how they had set a trap without him even knowing. They were circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. Kelvin moved away from the window, his pulse pounding in his ears. He turned back to the trapdoor. He could hear the faint sounds of the puppies, their soft whimpers still audible through the thick wood. They were unaware of the danger of the men outside who would take them if they could. But Kelvin wasn't about to let that happen. Not after everything he had been through. Not after they had given him a reason to fight again. His breath was steady but shallow as he moved toward the door, making sure it was locked. He had no intention of letting anyone inside, not without a fight. He quickly checked the windows, ensuring they were all secure. He had no real plan, no real advantage, but he had one thing going for him: determination. He wasn't going to lose these dogs, not now, not after everything. Kelvin's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything he could use to fortify his position. The rifle was a start, but he needed more. His eyes landed on a small wooden cabinet in the corner of the cabin. Inside, there were old planks, nails, and hammer, a few tools left behind by the previous ranger who had once lived here. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Kelvin moved quickly, gathering what he could. The cabin wasn't much, but it was his shelter, his last refuge. He would defend it. The snow outside continued to fall heavily, a thick blanket covering the world, but Kelvin could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The men were closing in their movements, deliberate, and there was no time to waste. Every minute, every second counted. His hand shook slightly as he grabbed the hammer, nailing one of the planks across the front door. He worked quickly, his breath coming in shallow bursts as he tried to calm the racing thoughts in his head. He had to stay focused. He had to protect the puppies. He had to protect the only family he had left. Kelvin paused for a moment, his ear pressed against the door. He could hear voices now muffled by the storm, but unmistakable. The men were getting closer. His heart pounded harder, but there was no turning back. He wasn't ready to die. Not like this. He took a deep breath, his hand steadying as he reached for the rifle again. The time for waiting was over. It was time to face whatever was coming. Kelvin's grip tightened around the rifle, the weight of the weapon grounding him in the reality of the moment. The air inside the cabin felt thick, every breath heavier than the last. He had prepared as best as he could with the meager tools at his disposal, but the truth weighed on him. There was no easy escape now. The men were getting closer, their steps crunching loudly against the snow outside. Kelvin could hear their murmurs, their voices low but unmistakably determined. They weren't just here for a passing visit. They were here for something, and it was something he wasn't about to let them take. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat thundering in his ears as the minutes stretched out. The storm continued to howl outside, but it couldn't drown out the rising tension in the cabin. Kelvin adjusted his position by the window, his body pressing low to the ground, his breath steady despite the growing fear. He peeked through a crack in the curtain. Through the swirling snow, he could make out the dark shapes of the men moving closer, their figures distorted by the blizzard but still unmistakable. Dale Morgan. The man leading the group was easy to spot. He moved with a quiet confidence, his silhouette casting a long shadow in the night. Kelvin's hand shook as he steadied the rifle, his eyes narrowing as the realization hit. They were here for the puppies. They wouldn't stop until they had them. The small family below the trapdoor, the only thing that had brought him any sense of purpose, was in immediate danger. The thought of those men, ruthless and cold-hearted, getting their hands on the pups made his blood run cold. He couldn't let them take them. Not after everything he had been through. Not after everything he had just started to rebuild. His finger hovered over the trigger, but Kelvin knew he wasn't ready for a direct confrontation. Not yet. He needed a plan. The rifle was his only advantage, but it wasn't enough against the numbers they had. There was only one way out of this, and it involved more than just him. He needed to protect the puppies no matter the cost. Kelvin moved quickly, his body tense as he set the rifle down and grabbed the only other weapon he could rely on his mind. He knew the land, knew the forest around the cabin. There had to be a way to get the upper hand, even if only for a moment. He didn't have much time to think. The men were only a few yards from the door now. As they neared, Kelvin's mind raced. He moved to the back of the cabin, carefully securing a few items in his pack. A few tools, some rags, anything he could use to make noise to create confusion. He wasn't going down without a fight, and he wasn't going to let these men walk away with the puppies. Kelvin glanced back one last time at the trapdoor. The puppies were safe, for now. They had no idea what was coming, and he wasn't about to let them suffer. The mother dog was resting, but he could see the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was still with him, still fighting. And that meant he had to fight too. He moved swiftly to the back window, the storm still raging outside. It was now or never. The men were at the door. Kelvin steadied his breath, gripping the rifle once more. His eyes locked on the men as they drew closer, their intentions clear. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him, but he didn't flinch. This was his fight now. With a final glance at the small family huddled beneath the trapdoor, Kelvin stepped toward the door, ready to face whatever came next. The storm outside was relentless, the wind howling like a beast locked in the trees, but inside the cabin the air was still. Kelvin stood by the door, rifle in hand, his heartbeat steady, despite the fear gnawing at him. Every breath was slow, deliberate. He wasn't about to back down. The men outside were dangerous, but he had something they didn't purpose. The footsteps outside grew louder. The men were close now, their voices muffled but distinct. Kelvin's grip on the rifle tightened. He didn't want to kill, but if it came down to it, he would. He wasn't going to let these men take the puppies. Not after everything. He could hear the men's voices clearer now. They were just on the other side of the door. His heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. They had come for the puppies, for the family he had sworn to protect. Kelvin knew he had no choice but to fight. The world outside, once filled with emptiness, had given him a reason to live again, and now he wasn't going to let that reason slip away. The door creaked open and 3 men stepped inside, their silhouettes framed by the stormy backdrop. The first man, Dale Morgan, locked eyes with Kelvin, his expression cold and calculating. His voice was rough but laced with a sense of authority. "Step aside." Dale ordered, his eyes flicking briefly to the trapdoor. "We know they're here. We've been tracking them for days." Kelvin didn't flinch. His voice was calm but firm. "You're not taking them." Dale laughed, the sound low and mocking. "You don't have a choice, old man." The moment stretched out, each second feeling like an eternity. Kelvin's finger hovered over the trigger, ready to act, but he couldn't make the first move. He needed them to make a mistake. He needed them to underestimate him. Then, without warning, one of the men lunged forward, trying to grab Kelvin's arm. In that instant, time seemed to slow. Kelvin reacted instinctively, pushing the man away with one swift motion. The man stumbled backward, but before he could regain his balance, Kelvin raised the rifle. The shot rang out, the sound deafening against the storm's roar. The man collapsed, his body falling limp onto the floor. The other two men froze, their eyes wide with shock. They hadn't expected Kelvin to fight back and hadn't expected him to be willing to kill. Dale, now more cautious, backed away slowly, his hand hovering near his gun. "You'll regret this," he growled. But Kelvin didn't hesitate. He had already made his decision. He wasn't going to let them take the puppies. He wasn't going to let them destroy what little hope he had left. He steadied his breath, aiming the rifle at the remaining two men. "Leave," he ordered, his voice unwavering. "Now." For a long moment they just stared at him, but the sight of the rifle and the body of their fallen comrade was enough to make them back off. Dale gritted his teeth, clearly frustrated, but the other man, his partner, nodded, signaling that it was time to go. They retreated, stepping carefully back through the door and into the snow, the storm swallowing them whole. Kelvin stood in the doorway for a moment, his heart still pounding in his chest. He didn't lower the rifle, not until he was sure they were gone. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, but for the first time since he'd arrived in the cabin, he didn't feel alone. He had fought for something, and he had won. He turned toward the trapdoor, his eyes scanning the small family below. The mother dog was still resting, but the pups, small, fragile, were still alive, and that was enough. It was more than enough. As he moved to check on them, Kelvin's mind raced with something new, a realization that hit him like a wave. These dogs, these little creatures, had saved him. They had given him back something he thought he had lost forever, a reason to fight. Without them, without this small family, he would have continued down the path of self-destruction. But now there was hope. They had given him a chance to rebuild, to find a new purpose. For the first time in months, Kelvin allowed himself to believe in something again. The puppies weren't just fighting to live. They were fighting for him too. Kelvin sat quietly beside the trapdoor, the weight of the rifle still pressing into his hands. He could hear the storm howling outside, but inside the cabin was eerily silent, save for the soft, rhythmic breathing of the mother dog and her pups. The tension in his chest began to fade, but a new feeling took its place. Something heavier. Something he hadn't expected. The puppies were safe for now, their tiny bodies curled up together, nestled against their mother's warmth. But as Kelvin glanced at the German shepherd, a sense of urgency swept over him. She had given everything for her pups, and now she was weakening. Her body lay still on the floor, her sides rising and falling in shallow breaths. The gash on her leg, which he had bandaged earlier, was still raw and bleeding, the wound refusing to heal. The snowstorm outside raged on, and the cold seeped into the cabin, making the already fragile mother dog even weaker. She had fought so hard to protect her pups, to keep them alive, but the weight of her own injuries and exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. Kelvin's throat tightened as he watched her struggle to lift her head. Her eyes met his, and in that moment he saw something that took his breath away. It wasn't fear, it was trust. Trust in him and the man who had entered her world uninvited, who had stepped in when she needed help the most. She didn't have to say a word, but Kelvin could hear her plea loud and clear. Help me protect them. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't let this small family down. Kelvin rose to his feet, moving toward the medical kit. His hands trembled as he dug through the contents, pulling out the last of the bandages and some antiseptic. The situation was dire. He knew it. But he couldn't give up on her. Not now. He knelt beside the mother dog, his fingers gently brushing her fur. Her body was cold to the touch, but there was still a spark of life in her eyes. Kelvin knew he had to act fast. If he didn't do something, she might not survive the night. As he worked to clean her wound, Kelvin's mind raced. He had patched up soldiers in the field before, but this was different. This wasn't a life lost in battle. This was a life of unconditional love, of sacrifice. She wasn't just a dog, she was a mother. And she had given everything to protect her pups, even when her own strength had nearly run out. The realization hit him hard. She was just like him. She had suffered just as he had. But unlike him, she had fought for something greater than herself. The memory of his wife's death flashed in his mind. Her smile, her warmth, the way she had trusted him to keep her safe. He had failed her. But this dog, she had given everything, even when it meant her own suffering. And in that moment, Kelvin felt the weight of her sacrifice. He wasn't alone in this. She too had known pain, loss, and the relentless pull of survival. Tears welled up in his eyes as he worked, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the raw emotion of the moment. He had been lost, broken, but this dog, this mother, had reminded him of what it meant to live for something other than oneself. As the night wore on, Kelvin did his best to keep the dog comfortable. He wrapped her in a blanket, trying to keep the warmth close to her body. The wind outside howled, but inside the storm seemed a little less fierce. He didn't know if she would make it through the night, but he wasn't giving up on her. For the first time in months, Kelvin didn't feel alone. He had a purpose now, and so did she. They were both fighting for something. The night dragged on, the wind outside intensifying, but inside the cabin there was a fragile silence. Kelvin sat beside the mother dog, his hands gently brushing her fur, his fingers trembling as he tried to keep her warm. He had done everything he could, cleaning her wounds, feeding her small drops of water, but her body was weakening, her breath shallow. She was no longer the fierce protector she had been hours ago. Now she was a mere shell, exhausted from her battle to keep her pups alive. Kelvin stayed by her side, his eyes fixed on her face. Her amber eyes, though dimming, still held a quiet trust in him. She had given everything for her puppies, and now, in her final moments, she had placed her fate in his hands. Kelvin's heart clenched as he watched her struggle to breathe. He had seen death before in the war, seen it in the eyes of comrades, seen it in the lifeless bodies of soldiers he couldn't save. But this was different. The guilt that had plagued him for months, the guilt from losing Laura, from feeling as though he had failed her, now seemed irrelevant. In this moment, the only thing that mattered was this dog and her pups. He wasn't ready to lose her, but he knew it was inevitable. She had fought long enough. Now it was time for her to rest. The final breath she took was soft, almost imperceptible, and her body grew still. Kelvin's heart sank into the pit of his stomach. The quiet that followed was deafening. His hands, which had been gently stroking her fur just moments before, now fell to his lap. The warmth that had been in her body was gone, leaving only cold. Kelvin's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't wipe them away. There was no anger in him, no bitterness, just sadness. A deep, aching sadness. This was the price of love. And sometimes, love meant letting go. He looked down at the mother dog, her body limp but peaceful, and felt an overwhelming sense of respect for her. She had sacrificed everything for her pups. She had been a warrior in her own right, fighting for those she loved until her last breath. Kelvin couldn't help but feel humbled by her dedication. It was the same kind of love he had once shared with Laura, the kind that transcends everything else, even death itself. Kelvin took a deep breath, steadying himself. He gently lifted her body, cradling her in his arms. The snowstorm still raged outside, but he wasn't afraid. He carefully made his way out the door and into the bitter cold, feeling the sting of the wind on his face, but pushing through it. He found a quiet spot behind the cabin where the snow had settled in soft drifts. There he laid her down gently, placing her body in the snow. The world around him seemed to stand still, the only sound the whispering of the wind. Kelvin said a silent prayer honoring the sacrifice this dog had made for her pups and for him. He buried her with as much respect as he could, placing a small pile of snow over her body as a final tribute. As he stood there staring at the small mound of snow that marked her resting place, he made a promise to her. "I will take care of them," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I will make sure they grow strong. They won't be alone." The storm continued to howl, but Kelvin's heart felt lighter, as though the weight of grief had finally begun to lift. The mother dog may have passed, but her spirit lived on in her pups. They were the future now, and he would fight for them just as she had fought for them. The next few days were a blur of movement, a cycle of feeding, caring, and watching over the 3 tiny puppies. The storm outside had subsided, but Kelvin didn't leave the cabin much. There was too much to do. His life had taken a new turn, and his purpose had shifted from simply surviving to nurturing these fragile, defenseless lives. He woke early every morning, the light from the small window casting faint shadows on the walls. The puppies, Hope, Brave, and Faith, were still so small, their bodies weak, and their movements uncoordinated. They would cry softly when they woke up, a sound that still broke Kelvin's heart every time. He would lift each one gently into his arms, feeding them the best he could. With each bottle of milk, they seemed to gain a little more strength, a little more hope. Kelvin spent hours each day caring for them. He had no experience raising puppies, but he was determined. He remembered the lessons of combat medicine he'd learned, treating the wounded, keeping them comfortable, helping them heal. The same principles applied now. He kept the puppies warm, fed them regularly, and even massaged their tiny bodies to stimulate circulation, hoping that they would grow stronger with each passing day. As the days stretched into a week, Kelvin saw the smallest signs of progress. Hope, the smallest and most fragile, was the first to start moving more. She would crawl toward his hand, her tiny body shaky but determined, her mouth opening and closing in search of warmth and milk. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Brave, the biggest of the 3, began to wiggle his way around the straw in search of his siblings, a little more active each day. Faith, the quietest of them all, followed close behind her, little paws patting softly against the floor as she moved. Kelvin found himself speaking to them more as time went on, though they couldn't understand him. His voice had become softer, gentler, as if he were speaking to the last remnants of his own humanity. They were his new family, and he had come to care for them deeply, even in the short time they had been together. The first real breakthrough came when the puppies opened their eyes. It happened gradually, a blink at first, then a little more focused gaze. Kelvin had been sitting by the fire when he noticed Hope staring at him, her amber eyes wide and full of curiosity. The sight brought a lump to his throat. The puppies were growing, and they were fighting to live just as he had. They were resilient, and their small victories were victories for him as well. As the weeks passed, the puppies grew stronger. Their coats became fuller, their bodies rounder with each meal. Hope, once the smallest and weakest, now showed the most energy, wagging her tail when Kelvin came into the room. Brave grew bold, exploring the corners of the cabin, and Faith, though still quiet, began to nuzzle against his hand, seeking comfort and affection. They were no longer the tiny, helpless creatures he had first found. They were becoming strong, lively, and full of potential. Kelvin felt a sense of pride that he hadn't felt in years. He had saved them, and in return, they had saved him. They had pulled him from the brink of despair, given him something to live for. He watched them with a quiet satisfaction, his heart swelling with emotion. They had survived, and so had he. As the days turned into weeks, Kelvin found himself more and more immersed in the world of the puppies. They weren't just 3 small creatures anymore. They had become his family. Each day he saw them grow stronger, more confident, more attached to him, and the feeling in his chest grew deeper, a bond that went beyond just protection and care. It was love. It was a love he hadn't allowed himself to feel for so long, Hope, the smallest of them all, had developed into the most energetic. She would follow him around the cabin, tail wagging her soft paws, clicking against the wooden floor as she trotted beside him. Every time he looked down at her, she would stop, stare up at him with those wide, amber eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of gratitude, and nuzzle into his hand. Kelvin would stop, crouch down, and she'd nudge her head into his palm, seeking affection. Brave was no longer the clumsy pup he had once been. He had grown into a sturdy little dog, his chest broad and strong and his movements bold. He had a spark of adventure in him, always exploring, sniffing around the cabin, as though he had a purpose in everything he did. Kelvin admired that about him, his courage, his curiosity. It reminded him of the man he used to be, the one who had once followed orders without question, the one who had stood tall through adversity. Faith. The quietest still had her gentle nature, but she was no longer the shy, fragile pup she had been when he first found them. Now she would seek him out for comfort, curling up by his side during the nights when the storm raged outside. Her soft, quiet presence gave Kelvin a sense of peace, something he hadn't known in years. She had a way of making the world feel a little less lonely, a little more bearable. Every time he looked at them, he felt his heart swell. These 3 puppies who had come into his life by chance had become his reason for being. They had brought him back from the brink of despair, pulling him out of the darkness, and in return he gave them everything he had. They needed him, and that need was a lifeline for him. They had helped him heal in ways he couldn't explain. They had reminded him of what it meant to fight for something, for someone. They had given him a purpose again. In the quiet moments when the world outside was still and the fire crackled softly in the corner, Kelvin would watch them play or rest by his side. He would feel the warmth of their bodies against his legs, their little breaths soft and steady. In those moments, he would reflect on everything that had led him to this place. The loss of Laura, the pain he had carried for so long, it had all been so overwhelming. But now, with these 3 little souls beside him, he could breathe again. He could live again. Kelvin had been a soldier, once trained to follow orders to protect others, but now, as he knelt beside these puppies, he understood something deeper. He had fought for his country, but now he was fighting for them. And that fight felt worth it. They had healed the wounds in his soul, those deep, unspoken scars, and given him something that he thought he had lost forever. Kelvin was still adjusting to this new life, to the quiet moments of peace he found with the puppies, but the storm outside was not the only threat that loomed over him. He had known deep down that it wasn't over, that he wouldn't be left alone forever. And now, as he sat in front of the crackling fire, the flicker of the flames casting shadows on the walls, his instincts, those of a soldier honed over years of facing threats head-on, told him the worst was yet to come. He had barely begun to breathe easy when he saw the first sign of trouble. Footsteps, heavy ones crunching through the snow outside the cabin. Kelvin's heart skipped a beat. He stood up quickly, moving to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer outside. There, through the swirling storm, he saw them, the same group of men who had come once before. Dale Morgan was at the front again, his dark silhouette cutting through the snow. But this time, something was different. They weren't just here for a look. They were coming for the puppies, and they weren't planning on leaving without them. The men moved deliberately, their bodies tense, their eyes scanning the surroundings. It was clear that this time they meant business. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a threat. Kelvin's grip tightened on the rifle resting in his hands. He felt the old anxiety rising in his chest again. The same feeling he had when the bullets flew in the battlefield, the same feeling that had haunted him every day since the accident with Laura. But this time the stakes were different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was his home. And they were threatening everything he had left. He watched as the men made their way toward the door, and the tension in the cabin grew unbearable. The puppies were nestled below the trapdoor, out of sight, unaware of the danger approaching. The mother dog was resting by the fire, but her instincts too seemed to sense the impending threat. She stirred her amber eyes, scanning the room, her body tense. Kelvin's heart was pounding now. His first instinct was to defend the puppies, to keep them safe at all costs. The cabin was the only place they could survive, and the men outside would stop at nothing to take them. The moment they entered, he knew there would be no turning back. This wasn't just about protecting the puppies anymore. This was about protecting himself, his sanity, his very purpose for living. Kelvin moved quickly, his hand shaking but steadying as he prepared the rifle. His eyes flicked between the door and the trapdoor, weighing his options. The men were close now, their shadows visible through the frost-covered windows. He could hear their voices growing louder, their footsteps getting closer. He had to make his move. They had underestimated him before. They would do so again, he hoped, but this time he would not back down. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm of danger inside the cabin. The silence in the room was deafening, and every second felt like an eternity as the men grew closer. Kelvin had fought for his country, but now he would fight for something greater. The family he had found in the midst of his darkest days. Kelvin stood at the edge of the cabin, rifle in hand, his heart racing with a steady rhythmic thrum. The storm outside battered the walls, but it was nothing compared to the storm of anxiety, fear, and adrenaline inside him. The men were almost at the door now. He could hear their voices, muffled but unmistakable. They were confident. They believed this would be easy. They had no idea what they were about to face. For the first time in what felt like forever, Kelvin knew that there was no turning back. The man who had once been a soldier, who had stood strong in battle, was no longer the same person. He had become someone else. Someone who no longer fought for a country or for glory, but for something far more precious. He was fighting for the 3 small lives below the trapdoor. For hope, brave, and faith. The weight of the rifle was both comforting and heavy. It reminded him of his old life, of the days when he followed orders without question. But that man was gone. The new man who stood in the cold, ready to defend what he loved, was different, stronger, braver. Kelvin's hands were steady now. His fingers wrapped firmly around the rifle, but it wasn't the gun that had given him this strength. It was the responsibility that burned in his chest. The puppies had given him a purpose, a reason to fight. He wasn't alone anymore. They needed him, and that was all the courage he needed. The men were at the door now. He could see their silhouettes through the frost-covered window shadows, shifting their footsteps, slow and deliberate as they closed in. Kelvin's heart thudded louder in his chest, but there was no fear, just determination. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about protecting what was his. The first man stepped up to the door, his hand resting on the handle. Kelvin took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the wall, his body tense, ready. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to act. As the door creaked open, Kelvin fired a warning shot into the air. The loud crack of the gun echoed through the cabin, shaking the walls. The men froze, clearly startled. The instant hesitation was all Kelvin needed. He rushed forward, aiming the rifle at the men now stumbling backward in shock. This is it, Kelvin thought, his voice low but firm. Stay away from the puppies. This ends now. The men hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough for Kelvin to see the shift in their eyes, from surprise to aggression. They didn't back down. One of the men lunged forward, and in that instant, Kelvin fired again. The shot rang true, striking the man in the arm. He collapsed, his scream echoing in the storm's fury, but Kelvin didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid. This wasn't about the fight anymore. It was about protecting the 3 little lives depending on him. The other 2 men pulled back, realizing they were outmatched. One of them reached for his gun, but Kelvin was already moving. With one fluid motion, he aimed, fired, and the man dropped to the floor, stunned. The last man, the leader, Dale Morgan, stood there for a moment, his face twisted in anger. He wasn't backing down, but Kelvin's resolve was stronger. "You're not getting them," Kelvin said through gritted teeth, his voice steady and unyielding. Dale hesitated. The storm howled outside, but inside the cabin it was eerily quiet, save for the sound of the men's heavy breathing. Kelvin stood firm, his rifle aimed directly at Dale's chest. Dale eyed him for a moment, weighing his options, but the reality of the situation began to sink in. The fight had gone out of them. With a final curse, he turned and signaled for the last man to retreat. The door slammed shut behind them, and Kelvin exhaled sharply, his body sagging with the relief that came only after battle. His hands were still shaking, but his heart had settled into a steady rhythm. He had done it. The puppies were safe. For now. Kelvin stood in the doorway, rifle still in hand, watching as the last of the men retreated into the storm. The door slammed shut behind them, but Kelvin knew this wasn't over. They hadn't given up. They'd just regrouped. The storm outside howled even louder now, as if the world itself was mirroring the chaos in his mind. The puppies were safe, for now, but the danger was far from gone. Kelvin's heart pounded in his chest as he rushed to the trapdoor, checking the pups one last time. They were all huddled together, still weak but breathing steadily. The mother's absence was felt deeply, but Kelvin knew he couldn't dwell on it now. There was no time for grief. With a heavy heart and a sense of urgency, he grabbed the 3 tiny puppies, carefully cradling them in his arms. He had to move quickly. The men would be back, and when they returned, they would be far more prepared. Kelvin's only chance now was to get them out of the cabin, away from the threat. He stepped back toward the door, glancing one last time at the small family that had saved him. The fire was still burning, casting a warm glow, but Kelvin knew he couldn't stay. The warmth of the cabin was a luxury he couldn't afford. He moved swiftly, taking a deep breath before stepping into the blizzard outside. The snow hit him like a wall. The wind whipped against his face, stinging his skin and blurring his vision. He could barely see more than a few feet in front of him, but he knew the trail. He had to get them to the old ranger's outpost, his only chance to find safety. His boots crunched through the thick snow, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The puppies nestled in his arms, their tiny bodies pressed against his chest for warmth. They trusted him. He couldn't fail them. As he made his way deeper into the forest, the storm continued to worsen, the wind howling louder, pushing him off course. Kelvin's muscles burned from the effort, but he pushed forward, his mind focused only on one thing: getting the puppies to safety. He glanced back once, barely able to make out the cabin in the swirling snow. He could feel the eyes of the enemy on him, like a presence lurking just out of sight. The men were coming. He could sense it. The panic in his chest surged, but he forced himself to stay calm. The more he rushed, the more he would risk losing the puppies. He had to be careful. Hours seemed to pass as he trudged through the snow, his pace slower but steady. The outpost was still miles away, but Kelvin kept moving, pushing the exhaustion to the back of his mind. He had no other choice. If he stopped, the men would catch up. If they caught up, he wouldn't let that happen. The trees around him thinned as he neared the clearing. The outpost was close. He could feel it. But the danger hadn't passed, not yet. Kelvin's breath fogged in the icy air, his heart racing not just from the cold, but from the fear of what might come. The men would be hunting him, hunting the puppies, and they wouldn't stop until they had them. With every step, Kelvin's resolve grew stronger. He would not let them take what was his, not without a fight. The cold seemed to bite harder with each step, but Kelvin couldn't stop. His breath came in visible clouds, sharp against the biting chill of the wind. The distance to the outpost had dwindled, but with every step he took, he could sense the men getting closer, closing the gap. The night was thick with snow, the forest silent, except for the howling wind and the crunch of his boots. His grip on the puppies tightened, ensuring they stayed as close to him as possible, protected from the bitter cold and the danger stalking them. Then, as if on cue, a shout broke through the storm. It was distant but unmistakable. Dale Morgan's voice. Kelvin's heart skipped a beat, the reality of his situation sinking in. The men weren't far behind. They had been tracking him, circling around, and now they were closing in. But Kelvin couldn't afford to panic. He had no choice but to press on. He pushed through the thickening snow, each step growing more difficult as his body began to falter. He had been running on adrenaline on sheer willpower, but now his legs were growing heavier. His mind, however, was still sharp, focused on one thing: the outpost. He had to get to it. It was their only chance. Finally, through the blizzard, he saw it. A faint light in the distance, the outline of the Rangers' outpost half hidden in the storm. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. The men weren't far behind. He could hear them now shouting to each other as they made their way through the snow, their pursuit relentless. Kelvin's pulse quickened. He could make it. He had to make it. Just as he neared the outpost, he stumbled his foot, catching on an unseen root beneath the snow. He fell to his knees, but quickly regained his footing. The puppies stirred in his arms, but they were warm, sheltered against the storm inside his coat. His determination surged again. He wasn't going to let them down. Not now. With the outpost in sight, Kelvin pushed forward, ignoring the pain in his body, the exhaustion threatening to overtake him. As he reached the door, he kicked it open with his foot rushing inside. The warmth hit him like a wave, but he didn't stop. He moved straight to the back room where he knew he could hide the puppies. Just as he settled them into a safe corner, the door slammed open behind him. He turned around, rifle in hand, as Dale and his men burst into the room, but they didn't get a chance to advance. The Rangers from the outpost, alerted by the gunfire and the commotion, had already been waiting. The men who had been hunting Kelvin were now surrounded, their weapons drawn but useless against the trained law enforcement. The Rangers quickly subdued them, handcuffing Dale and the others as they muttered curses under their breath. Kelvin watched in silence, the weight of the situation still settling in. He had won. The puppies were safe. The threat had been neutralized. For the first time in what felt like forever, Kelvin allowed himself a breath of relief. The battle was over. But more importantly, the fight for his life, for his purpose, had been won. As the Rangers took the men away, Kelvin turned his attention to the puppies. They were resting now, their tiny bodies warm and safe in the shelter of the outpost. Kelvin's heart swelled as he watched them, their soft breaths rising and falling in peaceful slumber. The fear and tension that had plagued him for days seemed to dissipate in that moment. The danger had passed. The storm outside was still howling, but inside Kelvin finally felt a sense of peace. The puppies, this small family, had saved him. They had given him the strength to fight to live again, and now they were safe. Kelvin stepped back from the puppies and sat down in the corner, his eyes closing as he leaned back against the cold stone wall. He had won. He had protected them. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a quiet peace settle in his chest. The days following the confrontation with the men felt surreal to Kelvin. The tension had evaporated, but in its place a new kind of uncertainty emerged. For the first time, he felt like he could breathe without the weight of fear or guilt hanging over him. The puppies, still so small but growing stronger with each passing day, had given him a reason to continue, to fight for something bigger than himself. But now, as he sat in the quiet warmth of the outpost, a new decision loomed before him. He had fought for them, protected them. But what came next? His battle had been won, but the future was still unknown. It was as if he had been given a second chance at life. But how would he live it? He could no longer hide away, retreating into the shadows of his own grief. He had to move forward. That was when he first heard about Freedom Paws, a sanctuary for abandoned service dogs, a place where they could find training, rehabilitation, and new purpose. It wasn't just a shelter for animals, it was a place where lives were transformed, both human and canine alike. They took in dogs like the German Shepherd's dogs that had served their purpose in the military or police force and gave them a chance at a new life. The more Kelvin heard, the more the idea resonated with him. It wasn't just a place for the dogs to be trained, it was a place where he could find purpose too. He had spent so many years being a soldier, following orders, caring for others, but never for himself. Now the opportunity to work alongside the dogs, to give back and train them, felt like a calling. It was exactly the kind of challenge he needed, a place where he could heal, where he could help those who had helped him, and maybe, just maybe, find a new sense of meaning. The decision was almost immediate. He knew it in his bones. He wasn't just going to walk away from the life he had rebuilt. The puppies, his new family, had saved him. Now it was his turn to save others, to provide the kind of love and care they had given him. There was no going back to the isolation he had once known. There was only forward, and forward meant embracing this new purpose. Kelvin packed up what little he had left, gathered the puppies into his arms, and set off for Freedom Paws. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time the uncertainty felt like an adventure, not a burden. As he made his way toward the sanctuary, the weight that had once burdened him seemed to lift, replaced by a lightness he had forgotten could exist. This was the start of something new, a chance to find peace, to heal, and not just the puppies but himself as well. He had found a new purpose, and with it, a new reason to live. The days at Freedom Paws were nothing short of transformative. Kelvin had arrived with little more than a duffel bag, the 3 puppies, and a heart full of uncertainty. But as time passed, the heaviness that had once weighed on him began to lift, replaced by a new sense of fulfillment. The days of isolation, the days spent mourning the loss of his wife and drowning in his own regrets, felt like they belonged to a different man. Now he was a man with purpose, a man who had found his way back to life. The puppies, Hope, Brave, and Faith, had grown into strong, healthy dogs. Their fur had thickened their bodies, well-fed and strong from the care Kelvin had provided. Hope, once the smallest and most fragile, had become the most agile and confident. Her tail wagged with pride whenever she passed the obstacle course set up at the sanctuary, and her sharp eyes sparkled with a sense of joy that made Kelvin smile every time she looked his way. Brave, the sturdy one, had blossomed into an impressive dog with a sense of leadership that mirrored his strength. He loved to explore, always trotting ahead with purpose, as if he were guarding everyone in his path. His training had come along faster than expected, and Kelvin knew that one day Brave would excel at search and rescue work, a purpose that suited him perfectly. Faith, the quiet one, had slowly opened up over the months. She was still shy, but there was a quiet strength in her, a calmness that often soothed the other dogs. Faith was becoming an ideal therapy dog, her gentle demeanor offering comfort to the veterans and volunteers at Freedom Paws. Kelvin had never been one to believe in signs, but Faith's calm nature was a reminder that sometimes the quietest presence could be the most powerful. They had all come so far, and so had he. Kelvin found peace in knowing that the puppies, the dogs he had fought so hard to protect, had grown up strong and healthy. They were ready for their own futures, ready to make a difference in the world just as they had done for him. Each of them was finding their place, whether as search and rescue dogs, therapy companions, or service animals for those in need. And every time Kelvin saw them excel, his heart swelled with pride. But more than that, Kelvin had found his own place too. At Freedom Paws, he wasn't just caring for dogs, he was caring for himself. The training he had started with the puppies had expanded into working with other dogs at the sanctuary. He helped train dogs that had been abandoned or mistreated, guiding them through the healing process just as he had done for the puppies. His days were filled with purpose, with the joy of watching the dogs transform just as he had. He no longer carried the weight of regret and grief. Instead, he had embraced this new life, knowing that he was making a real difference. At night, when he would sit on the porch looking out over the meadow as the sun set, the 3 dogs by his side, Kelvin felt a sense of peace settle over him. The pain of his past still lingered in quiet moments, but it no longer defined him. The love he had for Hope, Brave, and Faith, and the love they gave him in return, had healed the parts of him that were broken. They were more than just dogs to him now. They were family. For the first time in years, Kelvin felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. In the journey of Kelvin and the 3 German Shepherd puppies, we are reminded of the incredible power of love, loyalty, and second chances. Animals, especially dogs, have an unmatched ability to heal, comfort, and restore us in ways we often cannot imagine. Through the bond Kelvin formed with these resilient puppies, he rediscovered the strength to move forward and live again. German Shepherds, with their unwavering loyalty and sharp instincts, are more than just companions. They are heroes in their own right. They teach us the true meaning of sacrifice, selflessness, and unconditional love. The mother dog's fierce protection of her puppies, even in the face of death, mirrors the very essence of love itself. And as Kelvin learned to care for the puppies, he found himself healing, just as they did. This story serves as a powerful reminder that no matter how lost or broken we feel, love can find us in the form of a loyal companion and help us rediscover our purpose. It's about embracing the love and companionship animals offer, allowing them to teach us about resilience, compassion, and the importance of fighting for those we love. The bond we share with our pets is a reminder of how interconnected we all are and how the simple act of caring for another living being can transform our lives. Let us carry forward the message that love in all its forms, whether for a pet or a person, is one of the most powerful forces in the world. Through love, healing happens, and through love we find hope. Just as Kelvin found redemption and a renewed sense of purpose, we too can find peace by opening our hearts to the unconditional love of animals.